Hi, let me start with the context first. Imagine that you're the listing broker and you have received an offer and the seller is inclined to go with the offer, but the seller needs to counter. And one of the reasons the seller needs to counter is the seller wants to remain in possession of the property for a little while after closing. So, that could happen for all sorts of reasons. They wanted to remain in the possession of the property after closing they knew that when they listed the property with you, and you put in the MLS, please submit your offer calling for possession date 30 days after closing. But the broker who submitted the offer didn't pay attention to that or paid attention to it and is intentionally ignoring it. It doesn't matter. The offer comes in without calling for possession after closing, and there's no post-closing occupancy agreement. So, of course, you prepare a counter proposal, and maybe you even call the buyer side broker up and say, we'll be responding with a counter proposal calling for the seller to remain in possession of the property for 30 days after closing. And the buyer side broker says, well, that might work. Sure, send us over the counter proposal. You prepare both the counter proposal. So in the dates and deadlines chart in the counter proposal, you propose a possession date that's 30 days after the closing date, and you prepare the post-closing occupancy agreement. And you prepare the post-closing occupancy agreement. And you send them both over to the buyer side broker. And what do you get back in my story from the buyer side broker? You get the counter proposal signed by the buyer, but the buyer does not sign the post-closing occupancy agreement. And then, obviously the buyer doesn't get possession of the property right away, because in the body of the counter proposal, it calls for a possession date 30 days after the closing. But what are the terms of the post-closing occupancy? And the buyer is taking a position that the buyer is not bound by the post-closing occupancy agreement because the buyer did not sign the post-closing occupancy agreement. And so, what's the rent? Is there a security deposit, etc.? So how do you avoid this ambiguity? How do you avoid this problem when you are the listing broker? Now, before I give you the answer to that, let me also generalize this issue. This is not an issue just with post-closing occupancy agreements. It's something that could happen with a lot of things that you counter about. You might counter about exclusions of things like the chandelier and other items in the property. You might counter with a provision that says your buyer has a right of first refusal. You might counter that the seller who is selling this parcel but is keeping the parcel next to it gets an easement over this parcel. Well, what are the best ways of documenting that right of first refusal? What are the best ways of documenting that easement? What are the best ways of documenting what exclusions there are to the inclusions of personal property in the pre-printed language of the contract? And the answer is to have a specific document. To have a specific document that's, for example, the easement agreement, or for example, that's that right of first refusal. And so the question is, how do you respond with a counterproposal that is designed to include terms of another agreement? Now, you know the answer to this, but it gets sloughed from time to time. And that is, the counterproposal needs to reference the separate agreement. In the story that I told in the beginning, the post-closing occupancy agreement. And, it's not magic language. The Division of Real Estate's counterproposal form has a section 4 that contemplates that there might be attachments to the counterproposal. And it has within section 4 a statement, and I'll read it to you. It's about 6 words. Note, the following documents have been provided but are not a part of the counterproposal. You don't want to reference these things that are part of the counterproposal below that line. In section 4, above that line, above that note, what you want to do is you have a statement, for example, with the post-closing occupancy agreement. The post-closing occupancy agreement attached is made a part of this contract. And that way, if the buyer signs the counterproposal but neglects to sign the post-closing occupancy agreement, the buyer is still bound. If the buyer signs the counterproposal, and in a different example, neglects to sign the easement agreement, the buyer is still bound because the terms of the post-closing occupancy agreement or the easement agreement are incorporated into the terms of the contract by the reference to the separate agreement that is above the, not below, but above the note in section 4 that says stuff below this line is not part of the contract. So the action item is, don't count on the buyer to sign off on those post-closing occupancy agreements. Mention them above the note in section 4 so that the buyer is bound by the post-closing occupancy agreement, whether the buyer signs or not. Ladies and gentlemen, you know my line. We live in a complicated world. Be careful out there.